Let us imagine what happened to our workplaces if all those degrowth ideas became accepted and would be realized. Many of us would lose their jobs. I would say good riddance. Why? There are many reasons to be very critical of work. Today I want to give you a quick overview of radical critiques of work in the 19th and 20th century traditions of radicalism. Generally, work is criticized because it is one of the core elements of modern domination. Without work, capitalism, the state, and environmental destruction would be virtually impossible. Work is the field where exploitation runs rampant while all kinds of discrimination are reproduced. Some consider work to be something intrinsic good. Others regard it as a necessary evil. The anti-productivists think that it is an unnecessary evil that should be abolished. I use the term anti-productivism as an umbrella term to refer to any theory or action that is directed against the economic coercion and moral extortion that forces anyone to work. It is the antonym of productivism, which is the modern ideology that assumes that emancipation, freedom, prosperity, luxury and happiness can only be reached by working more and more. Throughout the history of radicalism, the productivism-anti-productivism cleavage cuts through other dividing lines of what can broadly be named the socialist movement. So we can not only distinguish the authoritarians, most of them Marxists, and the anti-authoritarians, most of them anarchists, but also the productivists and the anti-productivists. In what follows, I will focus on the anti-productivists and will show you their differences. Generally speaking, in the 19th century, the stance towards work was quite ambiguous, while in the 20th century, anti-productivism got stronger and more outspoken. Karl Marx is the most widely known critic of capitalism. In his early works, he stated that the oppression of workers is not just a case of economic exploitation, but also of human estrangement or alienation. On the one hand, the worker is alienated from the product of his work because it does not belong to him but to the capitalist. On the other hand, estrangement is manifested not only in the result but in the act of production within the producing activity itself, as Marx said. Thus, I quote Marx, labor is external to the worker, that is, it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. End quote. So, for the young Marx, work seems to be a vile thing, but nonetheless, he never called for the abolition of work. In the third volume of Das Kapital, he contrasted freedom with work. Quote, "The realm of freedom actually begins only where labor, which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations, ceases." End quote. Too bad that this is impossible for Marx. People will have to work in all social formations and under all possible modes of production, including communism. The best thing to hope for is thus a shortening of the workday, made possible by increased productivity. Consequently, Marx's most successful followers, that is, the Leninists and the Social Democrats, they sought to appear not only worker-friendly but also work-friendly. They adhered to a strict work ethic and imposed it on their subjects whenever they took state power. Some socialists adhered to Marx's idea of a shorter workday, for example, Paul Lafargue, who argued for the right to laziness, and Bertrand Russell, who hoped a tailor-raised economy to make possible shorter working hours, but they were minority voices. Curiously, the anarchists were equally ambiguous about work. Peter Kropotkin embraced technological progress and shorter working hours like many Marxists, but he also criticized the division of labor by gender or skill that imposed hierarchies and an impoverished set of daily activities on the workers. He wanted to make workplaces better and let people work in many different places and positions, so work would become agreeable. Then, he thought, the widespread idleness and refusal of work would cease to exist without need to punish lazy people. Because when work makes sense and fun, people actually want to do it, especially if it is only half a day until retirement with 40 years. Alas, when anarchists actually won a revolution, even only for a short time, they did not make the workplace better or the working hours shorter. See the example of the CNT in 1936 Spain. In a revolution, anarchists seized the means of production and collectivized them. But it was a situation of war, and the anarchists wanted to modernize rural Spain. So they thought industrialization was a good way to emancipation. Therefore, they forced workers to work hard and long, and they fought any laziness and called it parasitism. Not surprisingly, many anarchist workers opposed their own anarchist revolutionary syndicate and started diverse strategies of resistance against work. Absenteeism, fake illness, lateness, theft, sabotage, slowdown, indiscipline and indifference. The productivist policy of the CNT reacted to this with harsh punishments. In the end, Franco's fascists won the civil war, and all that have not been murdered or exiled had to work, because fascism is always productivist. In the 19th and 20th century, work in the factory was revolutionized by Taylorism, the scientific management developed by Frederick Taylor. This Taylorism meant strict division of labor and control of even the smallest movements of workers who were degraded to small parts of machines, just like the tramp in Charlie Chaplin's movie Modern Times. But since then, the work regime has changed. The new paradigm is called Toyotism. It means less hierarchy, intellectually more demanding jobs, even sometimes imposed fun for the workers. But the work is still just for the profit optimization of the employer, so the employee is still stripped of her self-realization and suffers from even more stress than before. Also, unemployment rates are higher than ever because of the high level of industrialization and computerization. So, workers often adopt a presenteeism strategy to be seen at the workplace as long as possible, to impress co-workers and superiors and to look irreplaceable. But they feel that their jobs are actually useless or even harmful, so many workers try the opposite strategy, downshifting. Working less for less money so as to win free time. Of course, one needs enough wealth to afford this luxury. For most workers, the threat of unemployment is quite alarming and stressing. But nonetheless, the rate of absenteeism and sickness leaves is astonishing in most European countries and in the US. It costs the United Kingdom 37 billion British pounds every year alone, and is similar in other countries, an official report from 2011 says. Just to show you how big the issue is. Of course, many of the absent workers are really sick, but for many others it is also a chance to grab some freedom, a true act of work defiance. Sociological research has not found out why people would try to avoid work, but most of the relevant sociological studies are either outspokenly productivist or they try to maximize profitability of corporations. They seem to be unable to see something inherently bad in work, which is a blind spot. So let us look at the radically undogmatic Marxists and anarchists that have turned against the stream of productivism in their respective traditions, formulated harsh critiques of work, and sketched anti-work theories and practices. The central figure of anti-productivist Marxism is André Gorz. He starts with the observation that the neoliberal order has already abolished work on a massive scale. But this order still sets work as an obligation and a norm that is the foundation of rights and dignity. Hence, everybody must work, but there are not enough jobs. This has devastating psychological and social consequences. Everybody must show their willing disposition, their eagerness to work in all circumstances. So hypocrisy spreads because every smile can be suspected to be a commercial smile of salespersons. A struggle ensues that forces everyone not just to work but to exclusively do things that are commanded and paid for by others. Other neo-Marxists build on and expand Gorz's critique. They emphasize the odd effects of high productivity. Classical demands of the left should be achievable, for example, shortening of working hours, better living conditions, etc. But in fact, higher productivity means an increasing threat of unemployment. Also, the liberal notion of freedom of contract has become an absurdity as neoliberal state policies have transformed welfare to workfare. Basic social rights have been supplanted by compulsory work. Michael Hirsch exposes contemporary work society to be a Platonic order. Plato, in his Republic, demanded everyone to have a specific place in society. Today, everyone has to have a work position they identify with. The economic existence and social status of the individual depends on a lifelong full-time job. Since there are not enough such jobs, the Platonic order makes individuals accept economically meaningless occupations, sometimes by threats of a debasing exclusion, sometimes by sheer force. On the one hand, this is necessary to reproduce the hierarchy of classes, professions and genders. On the other hand, this work does not add value to the economy, so it is purely ideology. This ideology, which in earlier times would have been called work ethic, is today upheld by an alliance of capital, unions, social democracy, state apparatus, media and the academy. Hirsch argues that this ideology has to be fought. Nick Srnicek and Alex Williams are anti-productivists, neo-Marxists too. In a similar vein as Gorz and Hirsch, they argue that, I quote, "The fact that so many people find it impossible to imagine a meaningful life outside of work demonstrates the extent to which the work ethic has infected our minds." End quote. This has an almost religious quality. Again, I quote, "The central ideological support for the work ethic is that remuneration be tied to suffering." End quote. To counter this, Srnicek and Williams, as well as Hirsch and Gorz, propose a new state policy, a universal basic income. If high enough, it overturns the asymmetry of power between labor and capital and unbinds the coercive aspects of wage labor. So in the end, it saves the workers from blackmail by the state and capital, resulting in greater autonomy regarding time and lifestyle. It also enables activities that make sense but are not profitable. But all four neo-Marxists have to concede that a universal basic income could also serve the capitalists if it is low, because then its recipients are still forced to accept all kinds of jobs and is in fact just a subsidy for capitalists who offer jobs no one would do without compulsion. It remains unclear how this danger could be averted. One may only guess that the neo-Marxists assume that the government that fulfills their demands will withstand a well-funded lobbying activity and also elections from then on. The state plays the central role in neo-Marxist anti-productivism. This is where they deviate most clearly from the anti-productivist anarchists. The latter reject all kinds of hierarchical organization like the state and focus not so much on theory but on resistant action. Today I will talk just about the anti-productivism of two strands of anarchism, primitivism and insurrectionism. There are more, but I don't have the time. The primitivist John Zerzan's main point of criticism of work, capitalism and civilization itself is the alienation inherent in them. But contrasting Marxism's theories about alienation, Zerzan focuses on bottom-up resistance practices without much theory. He tells the story of those artisans and workers that tried to flee or fight the factory and labor to maintain a maximum of personal liberty. He applauds the machine-breaking actions of Luddites and fiercely criticizes the unions that helped to shape the factory model of society by suppressing wild strikes and unruly workers. Zerzan's history of anti-work activism includes many contemporary phenomena like absenteeism, turnover, employee theft, illness, drinking, drug-taking, suicide, misuse of on-the-job time, sabotage, and so on. His criticism ultimately attacks even civilization as such. He compares the Stone Age, which he thinks was some kind of Garden of Eden, with today's work society, which is some kind of forced labor camp. It remains somewhat unclear how today's alienation could be overcome. The anarchist Bob Black proposes a ludic revolution, a new way of life based on play, as he says. He criticizes work because it degrades worker by discipline, makes them dumb and habituated to hierarchy, even in their free time. In the end, work is deadly. Black attributes most deaths by cars, industrial pollution, alcohol, drugs, cancer and heart disease to work because, I quote, "Even if you aren't killed or crippled while actually working, you very well might be while going to work, coming from work, looking for work, or trying to forget about work." End quote. Work steals workers most of their time, even if nothing valuable is produced in working time. Actually, as he says, most work serves the unproductive purposes of commerce and social control. End quote. Therefore, useless and pernicious work has to be cut down massively. Insofar as work serves useful purposes, it has to be transformed into a pleasing variety of game-like and craft-like pastimes, indistinguishable from other pleasurable pastimes, except that they happen to yield useful end products. End quote. I think that the group CrimethInc, which calls itself an ex-workers collective, propagates essential pieces of the ludic revolution in their publications. They are notorious for their positive stance towards the strategy of dropping out of the system. But they also advise to use the resources one has at their workplace to interrupt the system. CrimethInc wants a class struggle against class as such, and that can be fought by members of all classes. Because this struggle can quickly make the fighter unemployed, it is essential to build alternative communities that help each others and secure resources for all, even through shoplifting and other illegal means. The blueprint for this would be the workers' councils in historical revolutions, including the one in Spain, but with an explicitly anti-productivist stance. Now let me conclude by comparing the two camps of anti-productivists. The Marxists want the state authorities to distribute wealth and power differently and to change hegemonic public opinion. The anarchists, on the other hand, rely on the direct actions of individuals and small groups to build networks among themselves without ossifying into formal organizations. The state is deeply mistrusted. But the two strands of radicalism offer complementary, not contradictory strategies. And most points of criticism against work, alienation, exploitation, violence, degradation, submission, etc., are at the core of both Marxist and anarchist anti-work radicalism. Coalition building should be possible, even if serious reservations remain valid. Anti-work is radical because it aims at the radix, the root of exploitation and domination in capitalism. This is what differentiates anti-work from industrial action. It is not just a fight for better exploitation like higher wages for the workers or such, or for a more humane domination, safer workplaces and friendlier bosses and the like, but for the abolition of work as such. Anti-work is a political and cultural struggle. As a political struggle, it tries to wrest power from the masters. This can become a very dirty fight with violence, burning factories, using state authority and the like. And with compromise. But as a cultural struggle, it tries to build up new common senses and new practices, and this can be a beautiful act that inspires revolutionary association and facilitates free creativity. I hope this was of some use for you, and I'm looking forward to discuss all this with you. Thank you very much.